Hello, we're up to Numbers chapter 33. This is one full of a lot of words that are hard to pronounce. I'll do my best. The Israelites are going to, we're going to recount the journey from Egypt all the way to the Promised Land and every single place they stopped along the way. Here we go. These are the journeys of the children of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote the starting points of their journeys by the commandment of Yahweh. These are their journeys according to their starting points. They travelled from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the next day, after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. While the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom Yahweh had struck among them, Yahweh also executed judgments on their gods. The children of Israel travelled from Ramses and encamped in Succoth. They travelled from Succoth and encamped in Etham, which is in the edge of the wilderness. They travelled from Etham and turned back to Pi-Hahiroth, which is before Baal-zephon, and they encamped before Migdol. They travelled from before Pi-Hahiroth and crossed through the middle of the sea into the wilderness. They went 3 days' journey in the wilderness of Etham and encamped in Marah. They travelled from Marah and came to Elim. In Elim there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there. They travelled from Elim and encamped by the Red Sea. They travelled from the Red Sea and encamped in the wilderness of Sin. They travelled from the wilderness of Sin and encamped in Dovka. They travelled from Dovka and encamped in Alush. They travelled from Alush and encamped in Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They travelled from Rephidim and encamped in the wilderness of Sinai. They travelled from the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in Kibroth Hattaavah. They travelled from Kibroth Hattaavah and encamped in Hazeroth. They travelled from Hazeroth and encamped in Rithmah. They travelled from Rithmah and encamped in Ramon Perez. They travelled from Ramon Perez and encamped in Libnah. They travelled from Libnah and encamped in Rissah. They travelled from Rissah and encamped in Kehelathah. They travelled from Kehelathah and encamped in Mount Shepher. They travelled from Mount Shepher and encamped in Haradah. They travelled from Haradah and encamped in Markeloth. They travelled from Markeloth and encamped in Tahath. They travelled from Tahath and encamped in Terah. They travelled from Terah and encamped in Mithkah. They travelled from Mithkah and encamped in Hashmonah. They travelled from Hashmonah and encamped in Moseroth. They travelled from Moseroth and encamped in Bene Jaakan. They travelled from Bene Jaakan and encamped in Hor Haggidgad. They travelled from Hor Haggidgad and they encamped in Jotbathah. They travelled from Jotbathah and encamped in Abranah. They travelled from Abranah and encamped in Ezion-Geber. They travelled from Ezion-Geber and encamped at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. They travelled from Kadesh and encamped in Mount Hor, in the edge of the land of Edom. Aaron the priest went up into Mount Hor at the commandment of Yahweh and died there, in the 40th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 5th month on the 1st day of the month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. The Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the south of the land of Canaan, heard of the coming of the children of Israel. They travelled from Mount Hor and encamped in Zalmunna. They travelled from Zalmunna and encamped in Punon. They travelled from Punon and encamped in Oboth. They travelled from Oboth and encamped in Leah-Abarim in the border of Moab. They travelled from Liam and encamped in Dibon-Gad. They travelled from Dibon-Gad and encamped in Almon-Diblathaim. They travelled from Almon-Diblathaim and encamped in the mountains of Abarim before Nebo. They travelled from the mountains of Abarim and encamped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, from Beth Jeshimoth even to Abel Shittim in the plains of Moab. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their stone idols, destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. You shall take possession of the land and dwell therein. For I have given the land to you to possess. You shall inherit the land by lot, according to your families. To the larger groups you shall give a larger inheritance. and to the smaller you shall give a smaller inheritance. Wherever the lot falls to any man, that shall be his. Ye shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then let those you let remain of them will be like pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land in which you dwell. It shall happen that as I thought to do to them, so I will do to you. Well, I hope you're able to keep with me as we read through all those places. One of the things that we often get told at Sunday school, or the impression you might get from church sermons, is that the children of Israel wandered around and around in the desert. You get the impression they're going around in circles. But as you can tell from that list, they didn't go in circles. In fact, they never... It's a complete list of 42 places, and they're all in succession. But they did stay in one place, which I think is... I've forgotten the name of it, Kadesh Barnea, and I'm pretty sure they stayed there for a very long time, 38 and something years. So it's not quite what we thought, but they definitely were in the desert for the entire 40 years. There's some very interesting names in there. Now, a lot of those names, we don't know what they are. I was looking through Dennis Cole's commentary, and that's a pretty modern commentary. I don't always like to read the most modern commentaries because they tend to focus more on academics and less on spiritual meaning. But sometimes there's things that you need modern commentaries for, especially when there's recent archaeology, or in this case, I wanted to know, of all these places, 42 places that were listed, how many of them are known to us today? And turns out we know of about 28 of them, and there's about 14 that we have no idea where they are. Like, you couldn't, some of those names in there, you couldn't go to that place today. It's not possible to do so. And some of the other names, like Ezion Geber, we know where that is, you can go there. Mount Hor, where Aaron died, you can go there. And some of them we're not 100% sure, but we think we know. And when I reflect on that, I think that's quite amazing to think that there's 42 locations in a desert thousands of years ago, and we know where 28 of them are. And I think that's great. And maybe in the course of time, we'll come to find out some more. And that is something that's very cool about this part of the world, is it's so dry that archaeological things are preserved pretty much forever. Like, you think of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library. These documents were preserved for thousands of years because it was so dry. They just didn't deteriorate. So there's always the possibility of more exciting discoveries. And so maybe in the future they'll know where all 42 of these places are and you can go visit them. And anyway, the first one of these places was, it said they left the city of Ramses, which is in Egypt. And I want to just mention something about this. This city was called Ramses, but it wasn't called Ramses until the 1200 BC. Well, you know, Ramses, the famous prophet, Pharaoh Ramses was there. And if you watch the Ten Commandments movie with, you know, Charlton Heston, Ramses is the Pharaoh. If you watch other movies like Prince of Egypt, Ramses is there. But Ramses cannot possibly have been the Pharaoh, and the city cannot possibly have been called Ramses at the time they left. The city was called Avaris, and today in modern archaeology, the dig that's going on there, it's at a place called Tel Daba. Now, this is the same place as Ramses, but what's happened what's believed to have happened here is in later versions of the copying, when scribes have been copying out and they've been writing down the name of this place, Avaris, it's believed that nobody knew where it was, so they've just changed it to the modern name of the place. So by the time they'd been in the Promised Land for about 200 years, that city was now called a different name. And so the belief is that scribes have just, when they've been making the copy, they've thought, oh, no one knows Avaris, let's put in the name that everyone knows, Ramses. So that's just to clear up some confusion, because the Israelites, according to the Bible timing, they left Egypt in 1440 or so BC, which is around about 200 years before this city was ever called Ramses. So it's not a contradiction in the Bible. It's not messing up the timing of history. It's just, this is what's, you know, so all the experts that are Bible-believing experts, this is the way they understand this to be. So that's the first location, leaving Egypt from Ramses, but it was called Avaris at the time. And if you Google Avaris and the archaeological digs at Tel Daba, there's some really interesting stuff coming out about the Israelites. They go through lots of locations. I'm only going to mention two. One of them is Elam, and it says in Elam that there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. Now, I always think to myself, who counted the palm trees? Well, somebody counted the palm trees. What I think is amazing is that a meaningless detail like that has made it into our Bible. Like, they stopped at all these places. But this one place, Elam, someone happens to count the palm trees, and it gets written down in the Bible that there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and it's an oasis in the desert. And I think this is so interesting because it reminds me exactly, and I haven't read this in any commentary, it's just what comes to my mind, that Jesus had 12 disciples and he had 70 disciples. He had a 12 and a 70. And in Luke chapter 10, he sends out the 70 and he tells them to go minister to people, heal the sick, cast out demons. Another place, Jesus sends out the 12 disciples, same thing. And so these are people who are ministering the life of Christ to, hard hearts. Or you could say that Jesus' disciples were like springs in the desert. They were like fruit trees in the desert. You could say that about us too as Jesus' disciples today, that we're life and we're fruit. We're a source of blessing in a desert. And people all around us who don't know the Lord, they're basically living in a desert. But you who have the love of Christ, you're his disciple, and you are like a spring and you are like a fruit tree in the desert to those people. I just figured that all out based off the numbers, and I think the Bible is so full of these types of things, it's remarkable. The other place I want to mention is where they came to Sinai in the desert. And we already know, we've covered the book of Exodus, and we already know that's where the 10 Commandments were given. Moses went up Mount Sinai. So that's this location, Sinai, is where all of that happened. But people actually aren't 100% sure where Sinai is. And the most popular location for which we believe to be Sinai is St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt today. You can go there. Tourists go there all the time. There's a monastery obviously being built there. People pray. I personally am happy to go with that as the location, and for at least 1,500 years since St. Catherine's Monastery was built, that is believed to have been the location of Mount Sinai. But there's a few other theories going around. One of them even thinks it's in Saudi Arabia. I'm not convinced about that one, but just thought I'd mention it because it's interesting. And you can Google, watch some YouTube videos on the location of Mount Sinai. That they're all fascinating. But finally we get to the end of all the places, and they're on the plains of the Jordan, and they're about to cross the Jordan River, and they're going to go into Jericho. And that's going to be in the book of Joshua. But we're going to have the book of Deuteronomy in between, and that's going to be the last month. And they're going to be camped on these plains for that last month. So in total, there are 42 places here. If you don't count the starting place, because they're already there, then there's 41. Now this is really, really interesting, because if you go to another part of the Bible, if you go to Matthew's Gospel, starting with Abraham, all the way through to Jesus, guess how many generations there are? 42. But it appears though Matthew might have made a counting mistake. Looks like he might have counted someone twice. So guess what? There's 41. So we've got an interesting comparison here with two sets of 42, but they're kind of both two sets of 41. And one set, which is from Abraham through to Jesus, is the history of the process from when God intervened into humanity by giving a promise to Abraham, and how it went through all these generations and came to Christ, our Redeemer. It went from God basically not being at work in the world at all, people enslaved, all the way through to redemption, freedom from sin. And that's the 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus. And here we've got 42 places. We've got the journey from Egypt, complete slavery, not free at all, 42 locations, all the way through to Promised Land, where they are about to take their first city. So I think that's really remarkable. And the Bible is full of these numerical and symbolic and typological patterns. They're just everywhere. And my only regret is that we only spend 10 to 15 minutes on every chapter of the Bible. And I only spend about 1 hour per chapter researching and reading and thinking, whereas you could spend a day or 2 or 3 days on each chapter of the Bible. There's so much, and even then you wouldn't exhaust it all. The Bible is so rich and full of information. So here we've got Numbers 33. It's historical, it's factual, it tells us the process of their journey, but it's also full of numerical symbols that point us to Jesus. On one hand it's saying this is the journey of salvation. On the other hand it's saying you are a spring and you are a fruit tree in the desert, and you need to be a source of life to those around you. That's what we are, the Lord's disciples. So Father, help us to be your disciples. Help us to be a spring in the desert. Help us to be a fruit tree in the desert to those who are around us who need food, and those who need drink, those who need sustenance. Help us to be the Lord's disciples, bringing health and healing and blessing and strength to those around us. And thank you for the words of God, even in a chapter like this, just which is a list of places. We thank you, Lord, that you are in every part of the Bible as you are in this one too. In Jesus' name, amen.